Okay, so I've had this memory engraved in the back of my head for as long as I can remember since I was a little wee child, but I could have sworn at a Walmart when I was like 6 years old, I saw some kind of Transformers action figure frenzy toy that turned into a CD player, the way that he was in that first live-action Transformers movie, and I assumed that it didn't really exist, but recently it's been like on my mind a lot more, and I had to figure out once and for all. So I don't know what got into me, but I started digging, and I actually found it. It does exist, and I got it. So I'm just gonna show you every single thing that makes this way better than it needed to be. Okay, first of all, the CD player mode is honestly kind of perfect. I love how this looks. I mean, obviously there's panel lines everywhere, but even that gets a lot cooler once you see just how genius the engineering is. The crazy part is you won't find any robot mode parts hiding off to the side or the top when you actually start looking. It is just such a clean shape, with the exception of this one kind of suspiciously pressable looking button on the back. So it turns out this guy was released as a part of the first 2007 Transformers toy line, but he kind of completely flew under the radar for most people because he was in this gimmick focus subline that was designed for younger kids. This line was called Fast Action Battlers, and the whole gimmick of this line, okay, was that each character had their own gimmick. Like, that was the feature, that was the play feature, was that there was a different one for each toy that matched the character. So like Ironhide had firing cannons, whereas Barricade had some spinning blades. I don't know, is it weird to say that it's so thoughtful? Like, Hasbro, you shouldn't have. For me, that's all just to say this chunky button does have a purpose, if you could have guessed by now, and it's really fun.
Let me tell you something! Ow!
I'm sorry. It may be kind of inconsequential to point out, but this button, it doesn't really work like your typical spring-loaded mechanism where it's a little bit loose and janky and you know it's gonna wear out after 5 years or something like that. Instead, it acts a little bit more like a switch where you gotta push it, and then once it hits a certain point, it'll lock in and launch the disc. And it functions super well. It's probably the most satisfying mechanism that I've ever used in a toy, if that means literally anything at all. This also means that if the handle sticking out of the radio does happen to bother you, you can just leave the disc out and the button stays flush. I've had this thing for months now, and I just can't get over how simple and convincing this alt mode looks. And mind you, this is a figure that was selling for $10 back in the day, yet Hasbro had the gall, the gumption, to paint up the individual buttons or to label the specific radio station on the screen. Also, you might have noticed right next to the CD slot, he's got a second Decepticon symbol, but this one's sideways, and that's not a mistake, it's genius. And I'm gonna show you why. But first, also, bear with me, this schizophrenia is going somewhere, I promise. You might have noticed that his radio mode has a very disproportionate number of panel lines from the left to the right side. The reason for all this is because they engineered him with a completely asymmetrical transformation. This means there's virtually no rinse and repeat pattern from the left half of the figure to the right half. And I have to emphasize how unusual this is. Almost every Transformer has symmetry in its alt mode and robot mode, so it typically makes perfect sense for the conversion to reflect that. Even with characters like Skids and Mudflap, right, who have one larger hand than the other, it doesn't really matter because their frames are still a one-to-one reflection down the middle. And just like all those vast majority of Transformers, Frenzy is also designed symmetrically in the movie. So what's the point of all this, right? Like, why bother going through all this extra work when it seems counterintuitive? Well, it turns out they seemed pretty dead set on carrying over that shooting disc play feature to the robot mode so that it comes out of his chest exactly like it did in the movie. In order to make that happen, all of his arms and legs are stacked together at the bottom right-hand section of the boombox, then half of them swing out all the way around to the other side of the CD slot in order to form that torso with the disc in the middle. And that might have caused a problem with the launching gimmick by covering the button on his back, but they solved that by carving out a gap in the middle of the hinge. Then the original speaker folds up onto his back, and for a second it looks like it covers everything that we just worked for, but in reality it folds around the original button to extend it for robot mode. I'd never guessed that it's basically a button pressing another button, because they did it so well. It's crazy. Who thought of this? Like, what was the budget for this line? Is Jeff Bezos a Transformers enjoyer? So it's kind of interesting. From what I'm seeing online, it says that the budget for the 2007 Transformers toy line was not funded at all by Squarespace, but this video in fact is Wait, odds are you've heard about Squarespace at least once before, if not, 7,000 times since you woke up just this morning. They have been around a long time, and it really is a great site builder that, fun fact, I used to use as a child to build websites for fun in my free time, because that was my idea of fun. It's been really cool coming back to see just how much it's become this fully fleshed out ecosystem. I mean, they've got payment management for your online businesses now, or online stores that you can create to sell your products, plus their new design intelligence tool that'll help out with whatever little creative inspiration you might need. But one of my favorites is their invoicing tools. Essentially, I can now use Squarespace as a hub to create and send invoices directly from the site, which is insanely helpful, and as an added bonus, it keeps my invoice history nicely organized for whenever the IRS decides to burn my apartment to the ground after I tried writing off Robeson Grimlock as a dependent. The whole site builder is super intuitive, honestly, and odds are you can pull off whatever big ideas you got fishing around in your head. Make sure you guys check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and if you click on the link below, you'll get 10% off your first website or domain. And thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. As cool as this play feature is, naturally the downside to the asymmetrical engineering is that you're just gonna end up with some wonky robot proportions. I mean, that's just physics, But get this, he doesn't. Like, there's no obvious giveaways that this guy isn't perfectly balanced on both sides. The only substantial thing that I can really notice is the backpack, and even that's proportionately balanced. Thinking back to when I was 7 or 8 years old, it's kind of funny to realize even then that I completely ignored all these figures because of that kiddie, childish look that the packages had, and this is nothing compared to today's kid-style packaging. I don't know, maybe there's a message tucked away in there for Hasbro about kids not being as dumb as they might think. That being said, let's keep it real. Obviously, he's a little bit goofy looking. I totally get that. We're not breaking any ground with screen accuracy here, but all things considered, I don't think he's that far off the mark either. He's a charming kind of stupid. Plus, just keep in mind that Frenzy was always a physics-defying design that's basically impossible to pull off as a toy, which would explain why nobody's ever tried. So, given that context and setting aside this clunky hood head, they actually managed to turn a perfectly shaped CD boombox into this four-armed, chicken-legged insectoid robot with a functioning disc launcher. I mean, this is Frenzy, Like, the fact that I can even tell is incredible. Ow! When you're messing around with a figure, he's by no means the pinnacle of posability, but he's also not a brick, surprisingly. His head's on a full 360 ratchet joint. He's got an elbow bend for each of his forearms, as in not forearms, like it 4 arms, the quantity 4. Although it isn't not a forearm bend, I guess. That does remind me of the one major flaw, kind of drives me crazy, and it's his legs. They didn't give him any hinges on his chicken knees, and the really awkward angle of his feet make it impossible to stand him up without having his whole torso just thrusting forward. The way a normal person stands. My best solution is usually just to spin the bottom of his legs around backwards so he can stand with a normal center of gravity. It looks awkward and incorrect because it is, but I guess they had to nerf him somehow to keep him from just that true celestial level of perfection. We don't really know what would have happened, but I get it. Regardless, I would have loved this thing as a kid. I loved these toys to death growing up. They were perfect for me as a kid, but they also made me feel mature and smart, so it's just kind of funny that I've gotten surprised at how good this figure happened to be, as if it's some coincidence, when really that's the reason I fell in love with Transformers. It was this exact toy line that engraved the franchise into my personality because of how well made and thoughtful every single figure was. If anything, I think that's my takeaway from all this, is that I hope that kids now get to have their fast action battlers with an absurd amount of thought put into the stupid details they'll never appreciate until they grow up. Because the truth is, kids still notice. Even without realizing it consciously, they notice when their toy is clever and sturdy and fun, the same way that they'll notice when it's cheap and patronizing and generic. And while they might not notice consciously, I can guarantee you Hasbro will 10 years down the road when those same kids grow up and suddenly none of them come around to watch their new shows, or play the new games, or buy their new toys. But that's a whole other conversation. For now, I'm just grateful for what I had, and I couldn't have asked for anything better. What an awesome figure. Alright, later guys.
No.